If there were ever a storm that could ride horses, shoot arrows, and turn an entire continent into ashes, the people of the Middle Ages would call it by a single name, the Mongols. From the desolate grasslands of the steppe, an empire on horseback extended its claws across Eurasia, leaving behind blazing cities, devastated lands, and stories that still chill the spine to this day. In the 13th century, they not only conquered China, Central Asia, and Persia, but also thrust straight into the heart of Europe, where princes, knights, and even crusader armies had sworn to die defending the Christian faith. Yet before this storm, fortresses once thought impregnable became as fragile as straw in the hands of an arsonist. It all began in 1206 when Genghis Khan, hailed as the bearer of heaven's mandate, united the Mongol tribes. He transformed a scattered group of nomads into the most formidable war machine the world had ever seen. Each warrior was not only a horseman, but also an archer capable of shooting with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. They moved faster than any army in Europe, thanks to the YAM relay system. Networks of horse stations that coursed like arteries through the body of the empire. Orders from the Great Khan could travel thousands of miles in just a few days. The medieval world had never witnessed such terrifying power. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his descendants pressed ever outward, expanding the frontiers. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols had crushed Baghdad, the very heart of the Islamic world, in 1258 under Hulagu Khan. Yet an even greater prize lay to the west, Latin Europe. To the Mongols, it was a land of promise, fertile pastures for their horses, rich in silver and gold, and crowded with people to subjugate. The order was given, a spear thrust simultaneously into Poland and Hungary to divide the Christian armies and extinguish any hope of alliance. The spear point into Poland was led by Baidar. In February 1241, Mongol forces crossed the frozen Vistula River, struck Lublin, and set Sandomierz ablaze. They did not merely plunder, they spread terror, burning the Cistercian abbey to the ground. It was only the overture to a far greater tragedy. They divided into smaller raiding parties, sweeping across the land, yet keeping tight coordination with the main army of Subutai and Batu Khan advancing toward Hungary. Imagine it. Mongol cavalry detachments, like packs of wolves, fanned out across the fields, burning, killing, and breathing fear into the hearts of peasants huddled in their villages. The climax of horror came when Krakow, the heart of Poland, fell into the hands of the invaders. As the townspeople fled, legend tells of a lone trumpeter who remained atop the tower, sounding the alarm until a Mongol arrow pierced his throat. The warning call broke off abruptly, as if the very soul of the city had been strangled. On March 24, 1241, Krakow went up in flames. To this day, the tradition of sounding the trumpet from the cathedral tower endures, and the melody always halts midway, as a haunting remembrance of that moment. After burning Krakow, Baidar marched on Breslau, Wrocław. The population had already fled into its stone fortress. Baidar attempted a siege, but soon learned that Duke Henry II, the Pious of Silesia, was gathering his army at Legnica, only 40 miles away. More importantly, King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia was also on the march with reinforcements. If the two forces joined, the balance would shift. Thus, Baidar abandoned the siege, hastened toward Legnica, and ordered Orda to rally his forces immediately. The army of Duke Henry was in truth fragile, only about 7,000 to 8,000 men. Most were peasants armed with sickles, hoes, and wooden spears, men who had never known battlefield discipline. He had but a few armored Silesian knights, some mercenaries, and roughly 70 Knights Templar. Valiant monastic warriors, yet far too few. In contrast, the Mongol force numbered 6,000 to 7,000, but every man was seasoned, drilled into a single fluid machine. It was as if villagers with farm tools were set against a pack of predators, trained for the hunt all their lives. On April 9, 1241, the two armies faced one another on the fields outside Legnica. Henry arrayed his troops in 4 lines, placing the Silesian Knights, Templars, and Moravian soldiers in the center. When the Mongol vanguard charged, Henry hurled the Silesians forward to meet them, but immediately a storm of arrows rained down, throwing the European cavalry into disorder. Henry was forced to draw men from Greater Poland to reinforce, then personally led his armored knights in a headlong charge. For a moment it seemed he might break the enemy line. Yet at that instant, the Mongols unleashed their reserves, 2 wings closing in on the flanks, loosing arrows in deadly succession. Then they played a cruel card: smoke bombs of sulfur, bitumen, and poison. A choking haze severed cavalry from infantry, plunging the Christian host into chaos. Out of the smoke, Mongol heavy cavalry thundered in like a storm. The Templars, though fearless, were swallowed by the encirclement. The peasants, unarmed against such fury, became sheep before the butcher's knife. The Christian lines shattered. As blood flooded the field, the Mongols gathered trophies in grisly fashion, severing the ears of the dead and stuffing them into 9 great sacks to send as proof of victory. Duke Henry fled with 3 bodyguards, but one by one they fell beneath Mongol arrows. He was captured alive, then beheaded. His severed head was fixed upon a lance and displayed before the walls of Lenica. Inside the fortress, the townspeople wailed in terror, too afraid to show their faces. When the Mongols withdrew, Henry's wife searched the battlefield for his remains, recognizing him only by the extra toe on his left foot. The Battle of Legnica ended with Silesian soil drenched in blood. Though the Mongols suffered heavy losses, they had achieved their objective: to prevent the armies of Poland and Bohemia from uniting with Hungary. But the price they paid was not small. Many seasoned warriors had fallen. Behind that victory lay a desolate land, villages abandoned, corpses strewn across the fields, and a haunting terror that would weigh upon Europe for centuries to come. Blood and ashes at Mohi. When Hungary collapsed in a single night, after the fields of Legnica had been stained with the blood of Polish knights and peasants, the Mongol cavalry did not stop. Their true objective still lay to the south, the Kingdom of Hungary. The Battle of Legnica was merely a diversion, meant to block reinforcements from the north. The grand design of Subotai and Batukhan was to drive straight into the heart of Central Europe, crush the army of King Bellathor, and reduce his kingdom to ashes. If Legnica was a chilling trumpet blast of alarm, Mohi would be the drum of death, echoing like the end of days for the Hungarians. At that time, Hungary was a vast and fertile land, but it lacked strong fortifications. Most towns were protected only by wooden palisades. Stone castles could be counted on one hand. Bela's army was composed mainly of lightly armored horsemen and peasants, armed with little more than makeshift weapons. What unfolded in 1241 sent shudders through all of Europe. Poor preparation could plunge a nation into catastrophe overnight. As early as 1238, the Hungarians had already heard tales of Mongol brutality. Moscow was burned, Vladimir leveled, its grand prince and his family perishing in flames. By 1240, Kiev, the famed capital of Rus, had fallen. Churches, tombs, and palaces were ransacked and plundered. Fear blew westward like an icy wind. When the Cuman tribes, steppe horsemen themselves pursued relentlessly by the Mongols, sought refuge in Hungary, King Bela accepted them, even arranging a mass baptism to turn them into Christian subjects. But this very act made Hungary a thorn in the Mongols' eyes. To Batu and Subotai, harboring their enemies was the same as painting a target on one's chest. In the winter of 1240-1241, Subotai devised a meticulous plan. He knew the terrain intimately, where the rivers lay, where the swamps stretched, and chose the harshest season for his campaign. When the rivers froze, Mongol horses could cross with ease, while the enemy starved and froze in the cold. The Hungarians were unaccustomed to fighting in winter, but for the steppe warriors, it was an advantage. In March 1241, the Mongols seized Sandomierz in Poland. Baidar and Orda Khan ravaged the north, while Batu and Subutai led the main host into Hungary. The two thrusts were like jaws of a great pincer, pressing all of Central Europe into a suffocating grip. Subutai's cavalry moved with astonishing speed, using the YAM relay system and couriers to transmit information with hourly precision. Barely a day after the victory at Legnica, Batu already had word and adjusted his strategy. Such coordination made the rulers of Europe tremble. This enemy was not only powerful, but terrifyingly organized. In Hungary, King Bela IV scrambled to gather forces. He gained support from Croatia, a contingent of Templar knights, and even Archbishop Ugrin Shak, who donned armor and carried a sword like a general. Yet the army as a whole was a patchwork. Many nobles despised the king and were ready to abandon him when fortune turned. Peasants were panicked and near impossible to discipline. Subutai chose the battlefield, the plain of Mohi near the Sajo River. It was an open stretch of land, with the river to the front and hills and forests to the rear. A perfect trap. The Hungarians encamped there, using hundreds of wagons chained together to form a defensive ring. The familiar Wagenburg tactic against steppe cavalry. But they did not realize that this time their enemy had brought siege weapons, stone-throwing catapults, heavy crossbows, and even incendiary mixtures. On the night of April 10th, 1241, as the moon hung in the sky, the Mongols began to move. Subutai secretly sent a cavalry detachment across a newly built wooden bridge downstream to swing around from behind, while Batu led the main host in a direct assault on the stone bridge, where the Hungarians held their line. At first, the Hungarian soldiers managed to hold the narrow crossing. Mongol horsemen could not break through. Then came a thunderous blast. Mongol engines hurled massive fireballs, perhaps burning oil, perhaps laced with sulfur. Red flames lit the sky, the earth shook with pounding impacts, and panic swept the defenders. Men fell in waves, and the bridge was seized. By morning, the Hungarian host was forced to deploy onto the open plain of Mohi. At first, they fought with valor. The Croatians, the Templar knights, and Archbishop Ugrin Shak led the charge, cutting down ranks of Mongol horsemen. For 2 hours, the tide seemed to turn. Mongols were driven back, suffering heavy losses. It seemed as if history might be rewritten. But then, from the rear, Subutai's cavalry thundered in with 30,000 horsemen. They closed the jaws of their trap, arrows raining down, forming a tightening crescent of death. The Hungarians were crushed between two blades, Mongol cavalry to front and rear, arrows hailing from every side. At that moment, many Hungarian nobles fled, abandoning their king. The wagon fort was shattered by catapults, the defensive ring torn apart. The bravest held fast, men like the Templar knight Rambold and Archbishop Ugrin, fighting to the last until they too fell. The entire elite force was annihilated. King Bela IV escaped only by changing horses again and again, at times swimming across the Sajo, and hiding 3 times in the forest with his guards. Croatia lay in ruins, the Templars were slaughtered, and Hungary descended into catastrophe. After Mohi, the Mongols poured through the Carpathians like a flood. They seized Pest, set Buda aflame, ravaged as far as Zagreb, and even threatened Vienna. Populations fled into mountains, forests, or the rare stone castles that still stood. Wherever there were no walls of stone, there were only mass graves. Within a single year, nearly a quarter of Hungary's population was wiped out. Corpses lay heaped, villages lay silent. Chronicles record scenes of children impaled on spears, women dragged behind horses, fields turned into graveyards. It was no wonder contemporaries called it the wrath of God. Yet even in their triumph, the Mongols paid dearly. The Battle of Mohi had cost them thousands of their finest warriors. The storming of small stone castles consumed precious time and supplies. The Mongols were unaccustomed to the kind of guerrilla warfare that surviving Hungarians waged from forests and marshes. The harsh winter drained their stores. Horses died by the thousands of hunger. At that very moment, dire news arrived from the east. Great Khan Ogadai had died in December 1241. By tradition, the princes were required to return for the Kurultai, the council to elect a new great Khan. Though many objectives in Europe still beckoned, Batu and Subotai were compelled to order a withdrawal in 1242. Hungary was left in ruins. Belafor survived, but his kingdom was like a tree stripped of its branches. A year earlier, he had sat upon the throne over fertile plains. A year later, he walked a land strewn with ashes and bleached bones. Yet from the catastrophe of Mohi, Hungary would draw the vital lessons it needed, lessons that one day would allow it to rise again against the horsemen of the steppe. Why did the Mongols retreat from Europe? The mystery of why the Mongols abruptly abandoned Europe has haunted history for centuries. The battles of Legnica and the catastrophe at Mohi turned the spring of 1241 into one of the most terrifying memories in Central European history. People believed that if the Mongol cavalry kept rolling forward, soon Vienna, even Paris and Rome, would share the fate of Kiev and Buda. Yet the unimaginable occurred. Only a year later, that seemingly invincible army suddenly turned back, leaving behind blackened plains, smoking castles, and vanishing beyond the Carpathians like a nightmare dissolving into mist. Why would the same warriors who had forced the emperors of China to kneel, obliterated Baghdad, and crushed Hungary suddenly abandon Europe? For centuries, the question became a great enigma, a phantom shadowing the chronicles of history. Some scholars believed it was the will of God, that he had taken the life of great Khan Ogadai to save Christian Europe. The testimony of Giovanni da Pian del Carpani, the friar who traveled to the Mongol steppe soon after the invasion, was long regarded as proof. He wrote that God had intervened, striking Ogadai down at the exact moment that forced all Mongol princes to return home for the Kurultai, the council to elect a new great Khan. If Ogadai had lived a few more years, perhaps a sea of blood would have reached the shores of the Atlantic. But the truth was far more complex. The immense distance made swift communication impossible. Ogadai died in December 1241, yet at that time Subotai and Batu were already nearing the completion of their campaign. The road from Karakoram to the European front would take months to traverse. How, then, could they have known at once and withdrawn immediately? Modern historians, such as Rashid al-Din, Grand Vizier and chronicler of the Ilkhanate, argue that Batu's retreat was not solely because of Ogadai's death. The campaign in Hungary had already achieved its main objectives, but encountered overwhelming difficulties, heavy casualties, dwindling supplies, and fierce local resistance. On the battlefield, the Mongols triumphed, but in long-term control, they faltered. In Central Europe, Wenceslaus I of Bohemia was mustering a great army. In Hungary, though Bela IV had fled, the people refused to submit. Mountains and marshes became bastions of resistance. The Mongols were unmatched in open battle, yet clumsy when forced to besiege stone fortresses one by one. These strongholds devoured time, while their horses died for lack of pasture. Open cities were easy prey, but even a small stone castle could hold out for months. When civilians withdrew inside, taking livestock and food, they could endure indefinitely. Meanwhile, the Mongols lived off plunder. If there was nothing to seize, they began to starve. History records that during the second Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1285, many soldiers perished of hunger along the roads, simply because every village had already been evacuated into fortresses. There was another truth, seldom spoken. Batu Khan and Subotai were not entirely in accord. At Mohi, when losses mounted, Batu had wanted to retreat. Only Subotai insisted on pressing the attack. After victory, the tension between them grew sharper. By the campaign's end, with Hungary in ruins, Batu understood that to conquer all of Europe would mean endless sieges and facing the gathering Christian armies to the west. It was a gamble with no certainty of success. Imagine this. Had the Mongols pressed onward into Germany or France, they would have faced thousands of stone castles, far stronger than those in Hungary. They would have encountered armies larger and wealthier than any they had yet faced. In France, King Louis IX reigned, a saintly monarch renowned as a leader of the Crusades. In Spain, King Ferdinand III was waging holy war against the Muslims. These two kings, if they had seen Europe under threat, might well have united to muster a massive, disciplined, and well-equipped army. In that case, the Mongols would no longer have faced peasants from Poland or Hungary, but armored knights and skilled crossbowmen. Beyond this, the Mongols' greatest problem was logistics. They required vast stretches of pasture to feed hundreds of thousands of horses. Hungary still had plains, but in Germany and France, the grasslands grew sparse, the forests dense. Each day, the herds demanded an immense supply of fodder. Without it, the army itself would collapse. Even if they won victories, they could not sustain them. A Mongol army deep in Europe would have been like a tiger trapped in a thicket of thorns. For this reason, many historians now believe the decision to retreat was not merely due to grim news from Karakorum, but also because Subutai and Batu recognized their limits. They had already spread terror, proven their might, and devastated Hungary. That alone was enough to affirm the prestige of the Great Khan. Moreover, in the east, the empire itself was fracturing under the strain of succession disputes. Had Batu pushed deeper into Europe, he risked losing his place in the struggle for power at home. Thus, the Mongol withdrawal became a double-edged legend. To the Christians, it was a miracle of God. He had saved Europe from annihilation. To the Mongols, it was a calculated strategy. They withdrew after fulfilling their mission, sparing their men and their horses. And to posterity, it became a haunting question. What if they had not turned back? Suppose Subutai's host had swept past Vienna, surged into Germany, advanced to Paris. Would Europe have been consumed and human history rewritten from the ground up? Perhaps not. For the very problems of supply, the resistance of stone fortresses, and the wealth of the Western kingdoms would have bogged the Mongols down. History shows they could win battles, but they struggled to hold lands. In China or Central Asia, they could rule for centuries thanks to wide plains and rigid administrative systems. But in Europe, where every castle was a beacon of defiance, such domination could not endure. And so, when the Mongol cavalry turned back in 1242, Europe exhaled in relief, as though granted a second chance. Yet that chance did not mean peace. In the hearts of the Hungarians, the fear remained vivid. They knew the enemy could return at any moment. And from that fear began a sweeping wave of reform, one that would pave the way for Hungary's astonishing resurgence in the decades to come. The Battle of AIN JALUT, when the steppe cavalry was stopped. After leaving bloody footprints in Poland and Hungary, only to withdraw unexpectedly, the Mongol cavalry did not halt for long. The 13th century saw them surge once more from Central Asia, sweeping across Mesopotamia and striking deep into the very heart of the Islamic world. Baghdad, the resplendent capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, fell to the Mongols in 1258. The entire city was consumed by fire, with hundreds of thousands of civilians slaughtered. Its great libraries, treasuries of human knowledge, were hurled into the Tigris, turning its waters black with ink. With the fall of Baghdad, many believed that Islamic civilization had been broken at the root. The empire of the steppe now seemed unstoppable. After Baghdad, the armies of Hulagu Khan, brother of Great Khan Munka, advanced into Syria. Aleppo fell, Damascus bowed, and all the Levant trembled before the Eastern horsemen. Yet that road led them to a most unusual adversary. They were a class of warriors who had once been slaves, once despised, but who had become the fiercest soldiers of Islam, the Mamluks. Originating as boys sold into bondage from the Kipchak steppe, today's Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Russia, and from the Caucasus, Georgia, and Circassia, they were taken young, trained under harsh discipline, and forged into elite cavalrymen, masters of bow, sword, and warhorse. The Mamluk system had long been used in various Islamic dynasties, especially in Egypt under the Ayyubids. Yet, in an irony of history, it was these once chained men who would now stand as a wall of steel, protecting Egypt in the Islamic world from the Mongol tide. The decisive moment came in 1260, when the Mamluk host faced the Mongol cavalry head-on at AIN JALUT, a fateful battle that shook the Middle East. That year, Hulagu was forced to withdraw part of his army back to Mongolia after the sudden death of Great Khan Munka. He left behind a force in Syria under his general Kitbuka, numbering only about 20,000, smaller than the Mamluk host now gathering. The new ruler of Egypt, Sultan Qutuz, knew the decisive hour had come. If Cairo fell, the Islamic world would be brought to its knees. When Hulagu's envoys arrived, bearing demands for Egypt's surrender, Qutuz had them all executed. Their bodies hung upon Cairo's gates. It was a defiance no one had dared before the Mongols. On September 3, 1260, the two armies met at AIN JALUT, a valley in Palestine, once believed to be the battlefield of David and Goliath in the Bible. The symbolism only added to the sense of destiny. The Mamluks held the advantage in numbers and knew the terrain intimately. Qutuz, together with the brilliant General Baybars, laid an ambush among the ridges surrounding the valley. As combat began, the Mongol cavalry unleashed their familiar storm of arrows, charging forward at terrifying speed. Baybars deliberately engaged, then feigned retreat. Kitbuka, believing the enemy broken, shouted for pursuit, only to ride straight into the trap. As the Mongols poured deeper into the valley, the Mamluk forces sprang from the hillsides, encircling them in a tightening ring of steel. The cry of Allahu Akbar thundered across the battlefield, echoing off the valley walls. The clash turned into a whirlwind of blood. The Mongols fought with unyielding ferocity. Kitbuka himself charged into the fray, but the Mamluk encirclement was too tight, their numbers overwhelming. When Sultan Qutuz saw his left flank faltering, he tore off his helmet to reveal his face and shouted, "O warriors of Islam, I am Qutuz. Strike for the faith." His call ignited a surge of fury and courage among his soldiers. Both Mamluk wings pressed forward, slowly driving back the Mongol cavalry. Kitbuka was slain, and the Mongol army collapsed, scattering in panic. In an instant, one of the most feared forces in the world tasted utter defeat. The victory at AIN JALUT was more than a battle. It was a turning point in history. For the first time, a major Mongol army was completely defeated in direct combat. It proved that the horsemen of the steppe were not invincible. From that moment, Mongol expansion in the Middle East came to an end. Egypt emerged as the new center of the Islamic world, while the Mamluks were celebrated as the saviors of Islam. Europe, too, watched anxiously. Had the Mongols triumphed, they might have crushed Egypt, turned toward Byzantium, and threatened the Mediterranean itself. But AIN JALUT demonstrated that a disciplined force, wielding the terrain to its advantage, could shatter even the Mongols' fearsome tactics. For Europe, it was a glimmer of hope, that the end of days could yet be avoided. Yet Egypt paid a heavy price. Soon after the victory, Sultan Qutuz was assassinated on a hunting expedition, likely with the hand of Baybars, the brilliant general who had been crucial to the triumph. Power passed into Baybars' hands, and under him, the Mamluks opened a glorious dynasty that would endure for centuries. For them, AIN JALUT was not just a battle. It was the day a warrior nation was born. From the devastation of Baghdad to the miracle of AIN JALUT, the Mongol march through the Middle East revealed a profound truth. No matter how great its power, every empire has its limits. They could spread terror, but they could not consume lands where people were willing to fight to their last breath. The Mongol cavalry had once crossed the Carpathians, once razed the cities of Islam, but here, for the first time, they were stopped, and human history turned onto a different path. Hungary rises, from catastrophic defeat to a victory for the ages. The catastrophe at Mohi in 1241 left a scar on Hungary that seemed impossible to heal. A quarter of the population vanished, cities turned to ash, fields became mass graves. Yet sometimes out of utter destruction, a people find the will to be reborn. For Hungary, the memory of horror became the fire that forged reform and defense, transforming a kingdom once helpless before the Mongol horde into a fortress strong enough to repel their second invasion. After narrowly escaping death, King Bela IV returned to a land in ruins. He knew that without change, Hungary would not survive. The first lesson: stone castles. Where wooden palisades had been swept away like straw, the few stone fortresses had stood firm against Mongol arrows and siege engines. Bela decreed that any city-building stone walls would be granted tax exemption and special privileges. Within decades, more than 100 strongholds rose across Hungary. Major cities like Buda, Pest, and Esztergom now wore coats of cold, unyielding stone. The second lesson: heavy cavalry. At Mohi, peasants with sickles and hoes had been slaughtered, while a handful of Templar knights inflicted notable damage on the Mongols. Bela realized that to withstand the steppe horsemen, he needed knights in thick armor, able to endure arrow storms and deliver crushing blows. He reformed the entire warrior class, granting noble rights to any who could outfit themselves with war horses and armor. Even the middle class, if they could afford iron plate, could join the knightly ranks. Thus, Hungary built a formidable heavy cavalry modeled on Western Europe. The third lesson: ranged weapons. At Mohi, the few crossbowmen had shown their worth by piercing Mongol armor. Bela signed treaties with the Venetians, hiring thousands of skilled crossbowmen. The power of the crossbow, combined with stone fortifications, became the perfect counter to Mongol mounted archers. And finally, Bela encouraged immigration. He invited Germans, Vlachs, Romanians, and Slavs to settle, granting them land and self-governance. Population quickly recovered, towns bustled again, and the economy revived. Out of the ashes, a new Hungary was born, stronger, wealthier, and more prepared for the trials ahead. The chance to prove that strength came in 1285. That year, Nogai Khan and Talabuga, commanders of the Golden Horde, led a great host into Hungary once more. They believed the Hungarians to be as weak as 40 years before, but this time they were mistaken. From the very first steps, Mongol cavalry faltered. The people had withdrawn into fortresses, bringing livestock and grain with them. Fields lay empty, villages deserted, nothing left to plunder. The Mongol herds began to starve, and their soldiers withered with exhaustion. When Talabuga advanced into Transylvania, he encountered Hungarian knights clad in steel. In a battle near Terusko Castle, the Hungarian cavalry thundered down like a hammer of iron, crushing the Mongol flank and capturing over 1,000 prisoners. In the western mountains, King Ladislaus IV personally led his troops, unleashing a decisive counterattack that forced Talabuga into a chaotic retreat. On their withdrawal, his forces were ambushed by the Cumans, scattering them into ruin. Chronicles record that Talabuga returned with nothing but his horse and his wife. An exaggeration, yet one that conveys the depth of his humiliation. To the south, Nogai Khan fared no better. He seized a few small towns but failed to take a single fortress. When Ladislaus joined forces with the nobleman Roland Borsa, they crushed Nogai's remnants and drove him into retreat. The entire campaign ended in bitter failure. Hungary had repaid the shame of Mohi, 1241, with a brilliant triumph. After this defeat, the Mongols never returned to Hungary. They understood the land had changed. It was no longer an easy harvest field. In time, it was Hungary that carried war back into the lands of the Golden Horde, conquering Moldavia. From the position of a desperate victim, they became the aggressor. The story of Hungary stands as proof of a timeless truth. A nation may fall, But if it learns its lessons, it can rise stronger than ever. Mohi was once a humiliation, but it became the catalyst for Hungary's transformation into a fortress of resistance against the Mongols in Europe. Looking back at the 13th century, a time when the hooves of the steppe spread terror across Eurasia, we see that in places thought weakest, humanity found the strength to endure. At AIN JALUT, Mamluk slaves rose to shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility. In Hungary, a kingdom of ashes became an impregnable stronghold. Both prove that no empire lasts forever and no nightmare endures without end. Today, as we recount this tale, the echoes of Legnica, Mohi, and AIN JALUT still linger. They remind us that history is not only the story of the strong, but also an epic of rebirth. Hungary proved it. Defeat can crush a people, but it can also forge them into steel. And out of blood and ashes, a victory for the ages can be written. If you found this video fascinating, don't forget to hit like and share, helping it reach more viewers on YouTube. Share it with friends who also love uncovering the secrets of history, for perhaps they have never heard this story before. And if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to hit that button so you won't miss the next mysterious journey into the past.